We know that elected governments aren't really running our so-called democracies. However, who is? Someone's got to be running it. Today we'll be exposing the deep state like never before. Calling to the stage our first witness, Congresswoman, insider, sort of superhero-looking person, if you ask me. Here is Tulsi Gabbard talking personally about where the lawmakers interface with the law breakers and the law benders. It's Tulsi Gabbard on the lobbying industry. We'll be talking to her first. Also, the former state debt cyber expert Mike Benz will be telling us about deep state agencies. I love Mike Benz. We're going to have Chief Strategist to the White House, Steve Bannon, on centralized and decentralizing power. We'll be with you on YouTube for about the first 15 minutes. Then, where will we be? Basking in freedom. So we'll show you this bit for nothing, but then come over, join us, become an awakened wonder, go deep with this stuff. Here now is Tulsi Gabbard talking directly about her experiences with the lobbying industry, and just look at how she recalls, almost with sort of nostalgic pang, the strangeness of knowing how government really works. Something we've known for a little while, but it's always good to have insider information, isn't it? Let's have a look. Having spent a good number of years within the system, do you have anything that you can share with us about the actual practical abilities of a man like Joe Biden? Because someone like me, who's just anti-establishment in the most broad and sweeping way, would assume that whoever were in the White House, whether it was a socially capable individual like Barack Obama or George W. Bush, who at the time was kind of regarded, attacked as being a kind of a dope and a joke and stuff like that. I wonder how much actual executive power is wielded by a figure like Joe Biden, and the recent claim that he speak only in sound bites and do less PR and much shorter speeches seems to be an indication that they are acknowledging his senescence and cognitive decline. What's your feeling about this man, who once was a sort of a pretty potent firebrand, albeit a career Congress person and seemingly pretty corrupt in a bunch of ways based on what I've learned? He at least seemed cogent. How much actual power is that person capable of wielding? How can he make decisions? How can he direct power?
He has an incredible amount of power, and over time we've seen how, and this is something that Congress has either allowed to happen or willingly executed, which is an increase of a transfer of power away from the legislative branch and into the executive branch, into the hands of the White House and the President of the United States. It's an unfortunate thing because our system of governance, of course, is set up with three co-equal branches of government. But on the issue of war and peace, for example, we've seen that we have been in many wars and many conflicts, and yet Congress has not exercised its constitutional responsibility to be the body that actually declares war before that action can take place. They've given that over to the president and the executive branch because they don't want to be held responsible for it. This administration, the Biden administration, there are certainly challenges. There are certainly questions about his state of mind and his ability to be present and focused in the decisions that are being made. But ultimately, I hold him responsible. I have no doubt about the fact that he is surrounded by people who have, they're handing him the no cards and they're shaping the agenda. We see over and over how they go in and he says one thing and then they come back and say, well, no, he didn't actually mean that, and say the exact opposite. His handlers have a lot of power. There's no doubt about it. But he was elected as President of the United States. He is making the decision to run for re-election. He is the person that we as American voters must hold responsible for the decisions that are being made and the very dangerous consequences of those policies.
We're continually invited to regard the haunting and ghoulish figure of Donald Trump as a kind of reincarnation of the militaristic despotism that blighted the 20th century. But it's my belief, Tulsi, that what we're sliding into is a new kind of technological dictatorship, a despotism that is that bears the aesthetic of bureaucracy, that owes more to Kafka and to Huxley an Orwell than Hitler or Stalin, through the increasing power of the censorship industrial complex, through the ability to shut down protests, through the ability to shut down free speech, smear political dissidents and opponents, use the judiciary as a tool of weaponry, shut down the campaigns of active political opponents, whether it's through censorship or lawfare. Seems to me that the thing that we are being instructed to fear in the form of Donald Trump is already upon us in the form of this technocratic yet technological dictatorship. It's already arrived. Do you feel that?
Yes. It's more than a feeling. It's fact. You know, the evidence backs it up, and it's a very intentional, strategic move for the Democrat elite's narrative to be warning the American people, saying crazy things like, if you vote for Donald Trump, if he is allowed to win this election, it'll be the last election the United States ever has, that he will be the dictator-in-chief, painting this dark, bleak picture that you've just outlined, when the facts and the evidence show that they have already created this. And this is exactly the problem. They are weaponizing our public institutions. They're using the Department of Justice and law enforcement to go after their major political opponent in Donald Trump, but also going after our fellow Americans. You know, when President Biden said, you know, over half the country, I think he said 76 million voters in America are MAGA extremists, and they pose this greatest threat, domestic threat to our democracy. He painted a target on the backs of tens of millions of Americans who voted against him and for the other guy, voted for Donald Trump. And President Biden spoke to the country saying they are the greatest threat we face. When you look at the kind of implications that has on our society, and you look at the reality that, you know, parents are getting arrested for going to Board of Education meetings and standing and very passionately speaking about their child's education, or their fear and anger around the fact that their gentleman in Loudoun County in Virginia, where I happen to be today, he stood up and his daughter was sexually assaulted by a boy who claimed to be a girl in the girls' bathroom. And instead of the school and the Board of Education actually doing something about it and holding this kid and his family responsible for this, they quietly transferred him to another school without saying anything, without telling the parents of this girl who was sexually assaulted. And guess what? Within a very short period of time, this boy went on to sexually assault another girl in the girls' bathroom, even as he claimed to be now a girl. There are so many examples of how Donald Trump is the face of this figure who is being targeted. They are throwing everything but the kitchen sink, trying to tie him up in court, drain him of time and money and resources, smear his character, put out this narrative that they hope will cause voters to turn away from him and throw up their hands and say, well, I guess Joe Biden's the only option. But it's also happening. It's also happening to Americans who you will likely never know the names of. The consequences of this and the precedent that it sets. And you're exactly right. It is the elected leaders. It is the bureaucrats. It is the administrative state, many layers down, who are executing this. And the dangerous thing is they're doing this in the name of democracy. They're telling us we have to do this to save democracy. They're so terrified of free people in a free society getting the information wherever we want to get it, discerning that information and making up our own decisions, particularly as it relates to this upcoming election, that they're trying to get Donald Trump off the ballot. That over 32 states tried to unilaterally remove Donald Trump the ballot, so we wouldn't even have the choice to vote for him. And their excuse for that is essentially, well, we are trying to save our democracy. We are too afraid of voters making the quote-unquote wrong choice in this election that we have to undermine and destroy our democracy in order to save it. Save it from who? Save it from the American people from actually exercising our freedom. That's how twisted their mindset is. And it paints that picture of exactly where we will go as a country if they're allowed to do this and get away with it. And it creates that certainty for me and for others paying attention. If they're allowed to stay in power, this country that I love, that we love, will be gone. It'll be unrecognizable.
We can't continue to bring you this content without the support of our partners, who I openly thank. Here's a little message from them now. Pay attention. Of controversy was that he would leave it to individual states. I took that to mean that decentralization and federalism could be part of the solution to this increasing polarization, this growing contempt between people on both sides of the aisle, even though you are an indicator that those taxonomies are starting to melt with positions that previously have been attributed to one party now migrate in, the issue of free speech, the issue of war being but two of the issues that have altered, and they continue to flip and change as protests in colleges currently around matters in the Middle East demonstrate and reflect. I wonder, given that it's unlikely that post the November elections, we're unlikely to see a happy and gracious secession of power, do you feel that federalism and decentralization may at least in part hold the solution to what seem to be pretty seismic problems in your country?
Yes, I do. And it's something that, I've seen throughout my time serving in Congress and have understood how destructive it has been and counterproductive at best it's been when you have this big brother, big government overreach into our lives, into our schools, and into our communities. And going back again and looking at the Federalist Papers, looking at the thoughts and the intent behind our country's founders' vision as they crafted our founding documents, it really was. Our Constitution speaks to the very real limitations of government, the federal government, and its intent that power be decentralized really to the lowest level possible, where people know their communities. My home state of Hawaii is vastly different from California or New York or Montana or Texas or Florida. Every state has its own unique culture, has its own unique constituency. Our communities are best served and best able to impact decisions that are made, important policy decisions that are made when they're made at the lowest level.
With this deep loathing that many of us feel for institutional political figures and lawmakers from across the spectrum, because of the assumption that they are investing in stocks and shares that they have the ability to regulate and therefore benefit from, the assumption that companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon wield incredible power over American foreign policy, including the participation in wars that simply wouldn't happen if a more diplomatic perspective were allowed to thrive, or even, let's face it, a more democratic or representative perspective. What have you experienced of that? Are there points where you feel like, well, I know this, that this bill's likely to be passed, I should buy some stocks in Lockheed Martin? Or are there, what's lobbying like on the ground? What's it like to get lobbied? Is it true there are 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress? And where does the lobbying take place? And what is the prophylactic against lobbying?
Okay, this is a huge one. There's a lot of questions there. There are far more than 2 lobbyists per member of Congress. Many, many, many more. Many more. I couldn't even begin to count. One of the first things that happened is every member of Congress, you get elected, you go through what they call orientation briefings. And first they happen in a bipartisan sense where you have Democrats and Republicans, you go and sit in a room and, you get a brief on ethics, the ethics rules. You get a brief on, here's how the process works. You get briefs on here's the big issues of the day that you should be somewhat educated on, kind of a 101 introduction. And then they break us off into 2 different places and rooms and buses. Democrats go one way, the Republicans go the other way. And the briefings that I got as a new Democrat in Congress at the end of 2012, sworn in early 2013, were very much the same as those that my Republican colleagues got in a few distinct ways. Number one is, I remember they had a PowerPoint slide up showing how your average day would look. And it was shocking to me. I got to find that image because I remember capturing a picture with my phone. But the predominant amount of time, hours in the day, spent lobbying or spent at fundraisers with lobbyists or on the phone calling lobbyists and asking for money was the majority of the day. Really, so the amount of time you spent in your committees doing policy work or on the House floor for votes, on average, let's say it's 4 or 5 hours a day. The rest of the day you are spending fundraising. I went and I saw, okay, well, go to 2 different fundraising breakfasts every morning. Sit around a table with a bunch of lobbyists, and you talk about different issues or whatever, and you leave with a bunch of envelopes with political campaign contributions. And then on average, a member of Congress will go and have 1 or 2 lunches. Same situation. And then you'll probably go and have another fundraising dinner on any given day of the week, and make sure you go in and pop in and make sure that, get those phone calls to make sure that people show up to the next days of fundraisers. And this is how people raise tens of millions of dollars, all in the course of a day's work. I saw this, I experienced it when I first got there, and I was just like, man, this is wrong. I don't like this at all. And so I stopped taking any lobbyist contributions and political action committee contributions. And I loved it because I saw how my day was completely freed up. I was able to focus on my policy work and substantive work in Congress, talking to my constituents in Hawaii. But I saw the contrast. And one of my friends who is a lobbyist for renewable energy industry, she told me, she said, "Oh, wow, you're not taking any more money from lobbyists?" I said, "No." She's like, "Well, you're obviously never running for any higher office ever again. Your political career is done. You are where you are, and that's it." I talked to some like grassroots organizers who are working on different issues who came and visited me, and they said, "Oh my gosh, Tulsi, you stopped taking lobbyist money and PAC money. You must obviously be running for president." And it was just a funny contrast that happened in the course of a couple of days between the Washington insider perception, which is you will never go anywhere in politics unless you take our money, and the opposite coming from people who were like, the $5, $10 donations, the small dollar donations to support the candidate that they like, going out and knocking on doors and making phone calls, joining the cause of actually bringing about grassroots change. And their perception was exactly the opposite. Like, oh, thank God, you don't have anything to do with those corrupt Washington insiders. It is the power of the people who will prevail. I want to talk about the stocks, because this is a big one. I never, to answer your question directly, I never sat there and looked at a vote coming up and saying, I wonder how Microsoft is going to react to this vote. Let me go and buy some Microsoft stock. I saw the opposite. I went in knowing that perception is reality, and I did not do any stock trading at all of any sort for the 8 years that I was in Congress, because whether or not they are acting on insider information or it's just some happy coincidence that they buy $1 million of stock that magically goes up 200% within the next week when a vote is taken, it doesn't really matter, because perception is reality. Members of Congress, elected leaders, are held and should be held to a higher standard, and should not be in that position where there's even a perception that you are acting in your own self-interest. So I introduced legislation when I was in Congress that would have prohibited a member of Congress, their spouse, or their senior staff, their chief of staff, from trading in any stocks, because you have access to information that the public does not have, whether you're acting on it or not. Perception is reality, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. Both sides are doing it. They're making a lot of money. I've seen those memes that people put out that show different members of like what their net worth was when they started, and obviously the longer they're there, the more wealthy they become, and they're no longer really truly representing the interests of the people.
How did that legislation go that you introduced?
What do you think? What do you think? They're still doing it, if that answers your question.
We're going to have to leave you now. If you watch it on YouTube, click the link in the description, because Mike Benz is coming up. Mike Benz will explain to us, like never before, how the deep state operates. No one that I've met, certainly, has a deeper and clearer understanding on how deep state architecture meets with NGOs and the cartilage of power, organisations often funded by governments that spy on citizens and facilitate extraordinary global business deals. I mean, it's just mental. Things that we think of as just being like normal, like Google. Anyway, click the link in the description. Okay.
Yep.